A dramatic strategic rupture is unfolding in Northern Europe, and Finland is at the center of it. What has triggered the shock is not a missile launch, a mobilization order, or a battlefield breakthrough, but a legal and geopolitical shift that may prove even more consequential over time. A country of roughly 5.6 million people on NATO's northeastern edge has moved in a direction that now forces Moscow to reconsider the entire military balance in the high north. This is no abstract policy discussion. It is a live strategic transformation with consequences that could redefine European security for a generation. Finland is no longer acting as the quiet buffer state Russia once assumed it would remain. Instead, it is rapidly becoming one of the alliance's most hardened, prepared, and geographically significant frontline states. To understand why this moment matters so much, it is necessary to start with one of the Kremlin's deepest assumptions. For years, Vladimir Putin operated on the belief that NATO expansion could be contained through pressure, intimidation, and the credible threat of force. That assumption depended heavily on the continued neutrality of Finland and Sweden. As long as both countries stayed outside the alliance, Russia retained strategic depth across its northern flank and greater insulation for some of its most critical military infrastructure. That logic collapsed after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. What Moscow intended as a demonstration of coercive power instead triggered a profound shift in European threat perception. In Helsinki and Stockholm, neutrality stopped looking like prudence and started looking like exposure. Finland applied for NATO membership and formally joined in April 2023. Sweden followed in March 2024. Together, the two countries altered the security geometry of Northern Europe more dramatically than at any point since the Cold War. For Russia, Finland's entry into NATO was already a major setback. But what has followed since then is what makes the situation truly alarming from the Kremlin's perspective. Moscow has tried to answer the change with new military construction near the Finnish border. In Karelia, including around Petrozavodsk, Russia has begun expanding barracks and moving armored equipment into storage zones and forested staging areas. Further north, in the Murmansk region, new infrastructure has been developed to support artillery and engineering formations closer to Finland. Plans have reportedly envisioned a major troop increase in the border region, with force levels rising from a few thousand to many times that number. The message Russia appears to want to send is obvious. Finland's NATO membership will be met with military pressure. Yet the problem for Moscow is that signaling intent and generating actual capability are two very different things. Russia is still deeply tied down by the war in Ukraine, where manpower, equipment, logistics, and officer capacity continue to be consumed. The Kremlin can announce northern reinforcements, but the underlying question remains the same. Where will the trained soldiers come from, and what will they be equipped with? Empty barracks and construction projects do not equal combat-ready formations. That matters because Finland is not a state easily intimidated by military theater. It is one of the few countries in Europe whose national defense culture remains serious, even during decades when much of the continent believed large-scale war had become unlikely. The Finnish strategic mindset is shaped by history, above all the Winter War of 1939-1940, when the Soviet Union invaded and expected a rapid victory. Instead, Finland imposed severe costs on a vastly larger military power and, while it lost territory, preserved its sovereignty. That memory did not fade into symbolism. It became doctrine. Modern Finland has maintained one of Western Europe's strongest artillery traditions, one of the continent's most resilient reserve systems, and a mobilization structure that can generate an enormous trained manpower pool in proportion to its population. The country's long-standing model of national defense does not treat military service as a narrow professional issue. It treats preparedness as a societal function. That is why Finland can field a reserve far beyond what many outsiders assume possible, and why its war planning has always been grounded in the reality of territorial defense against a larger eastern neighbor. Now that same state, already deeply prepared before joining NATO, is being folded into the alliance's full planning and command architecture. The implications are serious enough on their own. But the development that has drawn the sharpest attention is legal rather than purely military. On March 5, 2026, the Finnish government announced plans to amend the country's 1987 Nuclear Energy Act. For decades, that law explicitly prohibited the import, manufacture, possession, and detonation of nuclear explosives on Finnish territory in both peace and war. In practice, it functioned as a legal barrier that limited Finland's options inside a nuclear alliance, even after joining NATO. That barrier is now being reconsidered. Finnish officials have framed the change as a response to a radically altered security environment since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The significance is hard to overstate. The proposed amendment does not mean Finland is suddenly seeking its own nuclear weapons. It means Finland is removing a long-standing legal obstacle so that it can participate more fully in NATO's deterrence posture and keep the option of allied nuclear infrastructure available if a crisis demands it. In strategic terms, that is a major shift. Finland shares the longest land border with Russia of any NATO state, stretching roughly 1,340 kilometers. Its territory lies close not only to St. Petersburg, but also to one of the most sensitive military regions in the Russian Federation, the Kola Peninsula. The Kola Peninsula sits at the heart of Russia's northern strategic system. It hosts the Northern Fleet, and most importantly, the submarine-based nuclear forces that underpin Moscow's second strike capability. Those ballistic missile submarines are central to Russia's deterrent credibility. They are not just one element of the Russian military machine. They are among the foundations of Russia's great power status. Any development that brings NATO's military infrastructure, surveillance network, strike capacity, or nuclear planning closer to Kola immediately becomes a matter of first-order concern for the Kremlin. This is where Finland's legal shift becomes far more than a domestic legislative update. If Helsinki aligns its legal framework more closely with NATO's deterrence architecture, it creates the conditions under which allied nuclear-capable systems could, in a crisis, potentially be supported on Finnish territory. The political signal alone is powerful. The operational implications are even more serious. France's evolving role adds another layer. President Emmanuel Macron has been pushing a more explicitly European discussion of deterrence, including the idea of forward-positioned nuclear-capable aircraft under French control during severe crises. France and Germany have also moved toward tighter strategic consultation on nuclear issues. In that wider context, a Finland that is legally open to hosting or supporting allied deterrence infrastructure becomes part of a much larger strategic story, one in which Europe's northern flank is no longer peripheral but central. From Moscow's point of view, this is precisely the nightmare scenario it sought to avoid. The Kremlin wanted to keep NATO away from Russia's borders. Instead, it has helped produce a northern environment in which NATO territory now runs in an unbroken chain from the Baltic states through Finland and Sweden into the Arctic, while legal, military, and political obstacles to deeper integration continue to fall away. Russian officials have responded with predictable warnings. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has described Finland's trajectory as escalatory and has warned that steps involving nuclear infrastructure would create new vulnerabilities for Finland itself. Such statements are meant to project resolve, but they also reveal something else: a clear Russian awareness that the strategic equation has shifted in ways that are difficult to reverse. That difficulty is especially evident when one examines the wider military picture. Finland is not simply inside NATO on paper. It is being integrated into the alliance's operational nervous system. NATO command structures on Finnish soil are moving from concept to reality. One headquarters supports land operations in Northern Europe. Another in Lapland is tied to Arctic warfare, a domain becoming more important as climate change transforms access, mobility, and maritime routes in the far north. A third, focused on communications and information infrastructure, is expected to deepen the alliance's digital and operational connectivity across the region. These developments are not decorative. They are the physical manifestation of an alliance preparing to treat Finnish territory as part of a functioning military system. That means planning, logistics, communications, intelligence, command relationships, and force flow. The real architecture that determines whether collective defense exists in practice or only in rhetoric. Joint exercises reinforce the point. NATO has already demonstrated that it can deploy large multinational forces into Finnish terrain and operate in extreme winter conditions. That matters because the North is not just another front. It is a specialized battle space where weather, distance, infrastructure, and terrain punish the unprepared. Finland, together with Norway and Sweden, brings decades of expertise in subarctic conditions that most NATO members simply do not possess. Russia is not facing symbolic enlargement here. It is facing a bloc that is improving its ability to fight in precisely the environment that matters most along the northern flank. The maritime dimension is just as important. Together with Estonia, Finland holds decisive geographic leverage over the Gulf of Finland, the narrow access route leading to St. Petersburg. In military terms, that means Russian naval activity in the Baltic is now far more exposed. NATO sensors, coastal missile systems, aircraft, and maritime surveillance can make freedom of maneuver increasingly difficult for Russian vessels operating in or near the Baltic approaches. Since Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, the Baltic Sea has become far less permissive for Moscow than it was even a few years ago. Sweden's membership compounds the pressure. For over 2 centuries, Stockholm had maintained military non-alignment. That tradition ended because Russia's behavior convinced Swedish leaders that the old security model no longer worked. With both Finland and Sweden inside NATO, the entire Nordic-Baltic region has been reconfigured. Russia no longer faces isolated states making individual calculations. It faces a tightening military and political continuum. There is, however, another layer to this story that deserves careful treatment: escalation risk. Serious analysts have warned that both Russia and NATO states are increasingly reading each other through worst-case assumptions. Moscow sees strike systems in Nordic territory and worries about what it interprets as potential first-strike vulnerability. Finland sees Russian construction, force generation efforts, hybrid pressure, and invasion precedent, and concludes that the threat is real and immediate. Neither side is inventing the other's capabilities. But there is always danger when capability is read as intent without sufficient diplomatic stabilization. That does not invalidate Finland's actions. On the contrary, Finland's response is rational, given Russian behavior in Ukraine and Russia's long history of coercion toward its neighbors. Still, deterrence works best when paired with clear signaling and channels that reduce miscalculation. The problem today is not that Finland is overreacting. It is that Europe is entering a new phase of militarized confrontation faster than diplomatic risk reduction mechanisms are keeping up. Finland's posture also extends far beyond conventional military planning. It has been hardening itself against hybrid pressure, an area where Russia has repeatedly shown sophistication and persistence. In late 2023, Finland faced an influx of asylum seekers directed toward remote border points in what Helsinki viewed as a coordinated effort to strain administrative systems, deepen political tensions, and test state resilience. Finland responded by closing the border and changing the legal framework governing emergency border procedures. It also accelerated the physical transformation of the frontier, including fencing, sensors, cameras, and enhanced surveillance systems across critical sections of the border. The meaning of that decision goes beyond migration policy. Finland is treating the border not as a soft administrative line, but as a contested security zone vulnerable to manipulation. That is a major conceptual shift, and it reflects a broader understanding that modern coercion does not begin with tanks crossing open ground. It begins with pressure campaigns, infrastructure vulnerability, cyber operations, intelligence penetration, information warfare, and engineered instability. Another revealing example came from the real estate domain. Finnish authorities blocked suspicious property activity involving Russian buyers near sensitive military locations, then moved to tighten restrictions more broadly. In practical terms, Helsinki has begun treating land acquisition near military sites not as an ordinary market matter, but as a possible vector for surveillance, access, sabotage, or influence. That is the mindset of a state preparing systematically for gray zone confrontation. These measures are not painless. Border communities that once depended on traffic, trade, and social ties with Russia have absorbed real economic costs. Local business activity has suffered. Cross-border family links have been severed. Towns that relied on a relatively open frontier have had to adapt to a more hardened reality. Yet Finland has largely accepted the burden because the security logic is deeply embedded in national consciousness. The country understands that strategic complacency carries a far greater price than economic inconvenience. When all these elements are assembled, the legal shift on nuclear policy, the NATO command integration, the force posture changes, the border hardening, the reserve mobilization model, the hybrid defense measures, and the geography of the Kola Peninsula, the larger picture becomes unmistakable. Russia has triggered one of the most severe strategic reversals in modern European security history. The war in Ukraine was launched in part to halt NATO's expansion and push the alliance farther from Russian borders. Instead, it accelerated exactly the opposite outcome. NATO gained Finland and Sweden. Russia now faces a much longer direct frontier with the alliance. The Baltic has become more constrained for Russian naval movement. The High North has become more militarily relevant. And Finland, once outside the alliance's nuclear framework in practice and in law, is now moving to remove the legal barriers that made such distance possible. At the same time, Russia's ability to answer this transformation remains constrained. The war in Ukraine continues to drain conventional capacity. Equipment losses take time to replace. Personnel quality has been degraded. Northern force generation plans look more ambitious on paper than they do in combat terms. Moscow can rely on nuclear rhetoric, hybrid pressure, and selective military signaling, but those tools do not solve the underlying problem it has created for itself. That problem is straightforward. Russia has made Finland more determined, more militarily integrated, more legally flexible, and more strategically valuable to NATO than it would likely have become under almost any other scenario. The near-term outlook points to deeper Finnish integration, not retrenchment. The border barrier system will continue to expand. NATO infrastructure will mature. The reserve and mobilization system will remain a national priority. Hybrid defenses will harden further, and if the nuclear law amendment passes, Finland will gain a new level of strategic optionality inside the alliance. In the medium term, one question will dominate: whether Finland becomes not just geographically important to NATO's deterrence posture, but functionally embedded in its nuclear support architecture. Even the possibility carries deterrent weight. It forces Russian planners to account for scenarios they once considered remote. It also strengthens the perception that Northern Europe is no longer a peripheral theater, but a core zone of strategic competition. In the longer term, the answer will depend partly on the outcome of the war in Ukraine and partly on the broader evolution of European defense policy. If Europe continues moving toward greater autonomy, deeper industrial rearmament, and more integrated deterrence mechanisms, Finland's role will only grow. It has geographic leverage, political will, military credibility, and a defense culture that aligns with the harsher realities of the current era. There is also a deeper lesson here. Finland did not improvise its response from scratch after 2022. It had spent decades preserving capabilities that others allowed to atrophy. It maintained doctrine, reserves, artillery, infrastructure, and institutional memory, while much of Europe lived under the assumption that major war on the continent belonged to the past. When history returned, Finland was not fully surprised. It adjusted quickly because the foundations were already there. That may be the most consequential fact of all. Russia did not create Finnish resilience, but it activated it at the highest level. By invading Ukraine, threatening European neighbors, and relying on intimidation to freeze the security order in place, the Kremlin instead catalyzed the emergence of a more unified, more alert, and more militarily serious Northern Europe. Finland is no longer a gray space between Russia and the West. It is becoming one of NATO's northern anchor states, and possibly one of the most consequential deterrence platforms in the region. For Moscow, that is not just a setback. It is a profound strategic failure of its own making. What is happening now is not a temporary spike in tension. It is a structural reordering of European security. The legal debates in Helsinki, the command sites across Finland, the border fortifications, the reserve system, the pressure on the Kola Peninsula, and the narrowing room for Russian maneuver all point in the same direction. The old northern balance is gone. A new one is taking shape in real time, and it is far less favorable to the Kremlin than the one Putin thought he could preserve through force.